All right, let's start our discussion about Visualforce controllers. We're going to spend the rest of our time talking about controller architecture. We're actually going to do a quick little reminder or a little recap about Visualforce page markup, and then we're going to jump into Visualforce controllers and talk about how we can create Visualforce controllers, how we can create things like multi-step wizards, controller extensions, testing controllers, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason we're talking about controllers here is because Visualforce controllers are written in Apex. So it's simply another implementation of Apex is to create a custom controller. So let's talk about Visualforce pages first. All right, so just a quick recap about Visualforce pages. So remember that Visualforce pages contain standard web content. They also contain Visualforce components, in other words, tags that start with Apex. And then they contain often data binding expressions, or in other words, our expression language syntax, which is the curly brace, exclamation, and then usually it's an object.field name. So the tags, example would be Apex page. The tags also have attributes, which are contained in quotes. Here's a sample Visualforce page. In this case, here we have the Apex page tag, which encloses all of our Visualforce pages. It has an attribute. Here we have a Visualforce comment. The second one is an Apex comment, but Visualforce and Apex have two different commenting formats. And then here we have a self-contained tag at the end here, some standard HTML and a level 1 header, and then some text that we're printing out, and then finally the end tag for our Visualforce page. So at the end of the day, it's a combination of Visualforce tags, like I said, and standard web content. And then what's missing from here is a data binding expression. Here's an example of a Visualforce component that uses a data binding expression. So one of our more common tags that you'll see utilized is the input field. In this case, the value attribute of the input field tag is set equal to curly brace, exclamation, and then contact.salutation, and then close curly brace. What this is indicating is that we are going to bind to the salutation field of the contact object, go out, get the value for this field for whichever record we are currently, which is contextual to the current record. And then in our case, this is an input field. What it does is it displays a label, and then it also displays the associated web control with the data type of that specific field. So in this case, a salutation is a pick list, therefore it renders an HTML select list in order for the user to interact with it. The expression syntax is typically what you'll see is the curly brace exclamation and then object.field. So anytime we're going to display or give the user the ability to edit a specific field, we're going to use that object.field notation. You will also see references to $. There are a number of, these are global variables. So global variables are identified with the $, and there's a number of them. There's about 15 or so. Some of the ones we're looking at right now, the $user is the currently logged in user. $page is a way we can obtain or reference another Visualforce page. And then $component is how we reference another component within the current page. The content within the curly brace exclamation is evaluated as an expression. So we can do things like we can insert in there, we can, for instance, call a function like, for instance, lower, which would convert this value into lowercase if we were simply displaying it. So just keep that in mind that it's not necessarily just a data value. It can be evaluated as an expression in the sense that there are certain functions that we can utilize when we're creating these expressions. As I said, the context for a page is provided by the ID, and that's the record that we would be displaying or allowing the user to edit at that moment in time. So for instance, here we have the ID query string parameter, and so this is providing us with the 15-digit ID that uniquely identifies a unique record, and then that way when we're populating our page with data, we know which record that we want to go out and get. For our expression syntax, there are three types of bindings that we can perform. There's data bindings for both viewing and setting data values. There's action binding, which allows us to define actions that we can execute when a user interacts with our pages. And then finally, component binding. Component binding is binding to different components within a specific page. So here's some more sample syntax. So here we have a reference to this hello and then the currently logged in user's first name. You are viewing the account. One of the things, this is a page that's referencing the standard controller for the account. So we'll talk about that in a second when we talk about controllers. But we're referencing or going to display the name of this particular account that would have been identified by the ID. And then here we're iterating through a list of contacts associated with that contact and displaying the name, mailing address, mailing city, and then the phone. Action binding, this is the mechanism by which we identify really when a user clicks on a button or some other event occurs within the web browser. What can we do to call some sort of method up on the server to perform an action? So we can create our own custom actions, or there's also standard actions which are available, which allow us to do things like save a record or view a record or so on. One of the advantages of Apex and Visualforce is that you can kind of pick and choose where you'd like to use these different technologies. So in the case of if you would like standard behavior, you don't necessarily need to write Apex code. So all the stuff that we did during the first portion of this class is optional. We can combine, though, that standard behavior with a custom look and feel. Or we could keep the standard look and feel. The same thing goes for the flip side of that. We might want to implement custom Apex. But that is not bound to the UI, so then we can separate that and pick and choose where we'd like to create custom pages or use the standard page layouts. Okay, so we've just spent the last 2.5 days talking about Apex, so the last thing I'm going to do is another module on Apex. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a new topic. So Visualforce controllers. This is, I believe, around page 20 if you're following along in your books. All right. Let's start by talking about standard controllers and where we can use controllers just in general and how they work. All right, so let's talk about Visualforce controllers in general. A Visualforce controller in general is one that receives requests from Visualforce pages, executes some logic, and then forwards the user to a different location. A Visualforce controller typically contains 3 different types of methods. So there are getter methods, or also called accessors, for getting data for the purpose of displaying it on a page or utilizing it otherwise. There are setter methods. The setter methods provide us the mechanism so that when we have our Visualforce page, the user does something like click on a save button. That's the way that we post or set the variables as they exist up on our controller by posting those values up to the server. And then there are action methods. Action methods are methods that are called associated once again with something like a button or a link, or some other timer, or some sort of, we can do some JavaScript event handling. There's all different types of things that we can do. But an action method is when a user does something, then we want to execute, once again, that logic, do something, and then forward the user either to a different page or keep them at the current location. All right, so in summary, there are 3 different types of methods. We'll come back to that and talk about that when we create our custom controllers. There are 3 different types of controllers. So there are standard controllers. A standard controller is built or created out of the box for you. It's an Apex class, much like custom controllers and controller extensions, but it is not available for you to view or to extend or to change in any way. The standard controller, like I said, is a pre-built, or anytime you create a custom object, it's sort of built on the fly, but it's created for you, and it allows you to do basic things like operate or edit data associated with a certain object, save that data. So really standard actions associated with viewing and saving data associated with that object type. There are also custom controllers. In the case of a custom controller, what you're doing is you are writing the logic, all of the logic, in Apex, so that when a request comes in, you write the code that's going to handle that request and then ultimately do something. Then finally, there are controller extensions. Our controller extensions extend either a standard controller or a custom controller. Controller extensions are utilized where we want to override a default behavior or provide some new behavior. All right, so let's take a greater look at our standard controllers. Standard controllers are created by the system. One of the things that happens if you think about something like an MVC architecture, when we're creating a custom object, we not only create the data model by creating that custom object and the fields associated with it, we also create, or behind the scenes, Salesforce will create the standard controller, so it takes care of the C in the MVC architecture. It also creates a page layout associated with that custom object, so it also creates the V in an MVC architecture. Okay? So a custom object, the reason we call it an object as opposed to being a table, is that it does a lot more than simply be the data store or the data model within your application. Every standard object and custom object has a standard controller. In our Visualforce pages, we can reference that standard controller via the Apex page tag by setting the standard controller attribute. All we do is we set the standard controller attribute equal to the name of that standard object or custom object. By the way, a single Visualforce page can only reference one controller at a time. It can reference one or many extensions, though, one of the advantages of using extensions. All right. Standard controllers allow us to do data binding. What we're doing with the standard controllers, this is where we're using the object.field name syntax. So when using the standard controller associated with, for instance, let's say something like our job application within our recruiting application, we can view data associated with the current S object. So if it's job application, we can view the fields associated with that using the standard controller. We can also access one level down, we can view the related list. So we could identify a related list that we'd like to view fields from that child object type. In addition, we can also navigate 5 levels up and view data from parents, grandparents, and so on of any objects which are related to the current object. So, and then once again, we know which record based on the ID parameter. Okay. So. All right. Sorry about the recap here, but here we are going referencing the parents and then referencing the one level down for the children. And we can do that using the dot notation in the in our Visualforce page. You can obtain these names, by the way, from the schema browser. So if you need to figure out, for instance, what is the name of the related list of contacts, you can go into the schema browser and click on child relationships. All right. When using our standard controller, one of the things it does is it applies our validation rules, and that's actually true really of, validation rules always fire regardless of the controller. But one of the things it does is it returns, if we're using input fields, we can then display field level error messages. And then if our validation rule returns a page level message, that'll then return that to the either the messages or the page messages tag area within our Visualforce page. Standard controllers also have 6 standard actions which are available. So when we're performing one of those action methods, out of the box we get 6 of them. There are a number of different ways that we can call those standard actions. The most common one is the command button. When a user clicks on a command button, we can identify the action that we'd like to call by utilizing the action attribute. Same thing, very similar with the command link, except instead of a button, it's a link. And then there's some AJAX-enabled tags, things like the action polar, the action support, and the action function. What these do, these are 3 different mechanisms for calling those action methods. The action support is based on event handling. The polar is, I always use the example of a, something like a stock quote type thing where we're continually going out and getting the latest values. Or the function, which is, it will generate a JavaScript function, which we can then call from some JavaScript that we write in order to perform that request. Here are the 6 standard action methods. We reference these within our Visualforce pages by doing curly brace exclamation method name. So for instance, if we wanted to create a command button and then call the save method, what we would do is we would reference that as curly brace exclamation save and then close curly brace. Same thing goes for all of these other ones. These have a lot of commonalities. If you think about the difference between a save and a quick save, first of all, a quick save is an apply, so it's keep you in the same location. So a quick save and a save, they both do the same thing in terms of writing the data to the database. The difference is really where do we forward the user in terms of navigation. A save will forward a user to a view page, and a quick save will leave the user on the edit page. So the view has something in common with the save in the sense that the navigation is the same. Both of these take us to the view page. The difference is that the view does not write data to the database. In addition to, one thing that we kind of mentioned briefly here is that in addition to sort of the standard controllers in which it's assumed that you're operating on a single record, there's also standard list controllers. And what these do is this is when you're operating on multiple records. So if you think about anytime you click on a tab and you're accessing a list view, and you click on the Go button to display a list of records, you're not operating or looking at a single record, you're looking at a list of records. Well, you could create custom Visualforce pages that do similar, create a similar user interface. And in that case, what you would do is you would utilize the standard list controller. In addition to the standard action methods associated with the detail, there's also the first, last, next, and previous to give you the ability to control pagination. So here's a very simplistic example of a Visualforce page that's using the list controller. Notice there's an attribute called record set var, which really defines that we want to use the list controller, and what this does is it gives it an alias so that then within our Visualforce page we can then reference our list of whatever it may be by whatever name we define, in this case accounts. Okay. All right, so why don't we take a moment to do a quiz, and then after we're done with that we'll open it up for some Q&A. All right, what is the purpose of a controller? What are its two main purposes, or there are many purposes? Both getting and setting of data, a means by which the user can interact from a user interface. Our Visualforce page is the way that we interact with our controllers, but it allows the user to submit requests in the form of something like an action method. And then we can get and set values as a part of that. And then finally, for the user to a different location, so well, the same location or a different location based on our navigation instructions. All right. Which objects have associated standard controllers? Standard and custom objects. So what is included with each standard controller? We can traverse data 5 levels up and then 1 level down. What are the types of methods that we can call? How about that?
Save, quick save, edit.
Very good, very good. So there's 6 different standard action methods. When a user performs some sort of action, or maybe we've automated it via Ajax. So there's the save, quick save, edit, view, cancel, and delete. Very good. What is included, or I'm sorry, when do you need to go beyond a standard controller and code custom Apex? The typical use case is that the standard controller is great for simply, viewing, editing, saving data, and it's very oriented towards a single object type at a time. Anytime we want to go beyond that, we would then create a custom controller or a controller extension. Okay. All right. So any questions? Yes, Tom.
On that slide 50, where they were talking about the way you could test a URL known IDs, I was trying that out, but I'm trying to understand the format of the job app candidate info. Where did that come from? Is that the name of an object? Is that the name? What is it?
Oh,
what is
okay.
the name of?
So in this URL that we're looking at, which is NA4 Salesforce.com, Apex, and then job app candidate info, and then question mark ID equals. So are you asking where did job app candidate info come from? Is that correct?
I'm guessing that the ID is the ID of a job app candidate. But
Yeah. Okay. So anything that appears within a URL within Salesforce, anything after the Salesforce or force.com, and then we have the Apex folder, anything after that would then be the name of our Visualforce page. So in this case, there is a Visualforce page called Job App Candidate Info. Okay. Then the question mark delineates where we then start our query string parameters.
Yeah, I know the rest of it. I was trying to find job app candidate info in
it's
the IDE to find where you got that name.
It's a Visualforce page, and by default, in terms of custom Visualforce pages, you simply don't have that Visualforce page.
Oh, so this only works for standard pages.
No, this is so job app candidate info is just a sample name of a Visualforce page, but it simply doesn't exist in the org that you're looking at.
Okay, so we must have some that do.
Oh, yes, we do.
And where would I find one of
for
those?
instance, remember the job posting site IP lookup that we accessed previously? That was a Visualforce page that we had.
So that's the only one right now we have.
There's probably a bunch of others. Off the top of my head, I can't remember them. If you go to Setup and then you click on Develop Pages,
I see. Okay, so
you can see a full list of all of the available Visualforce pages. So, okay. All right. Any other questions? All right. Why don't we then continue with our lecture topics? All right. So let's talk about Module 3, which is Visualforce controller extensions and custom controllers. All right. So we're going to talk about creating our own custom controllers and controller extensions. So going beyond that standard controller which is provided for us. Our first, we're going to just talk about custom controller code in general, and then we're going to talk about specifically controller extensions and custom controllers. So why would you want to create a custom controller or a controller extension? Well, there's a number of different reasons, but the two most basic reasons or categories of reasons would be that you want to change the existing functionality or you want to add new functionality. Let me give you an example of changing existing functionality. One of the things that we've done already is we've created that web service that validates a candidate's address. Well, one of the things we might want to do is before we save a candidate, and specifically their address, whenever a user might be filling out a form within Salesforce with the address information, when we click on that Save button, instead of simply writing it immediately to the database, instead what we can do is we can do that web service call out to the StrikeIron site to check if this is a valid address, and then if it is, then insert it into the database or then update it within the database. So in that case, it's still the save functionality, but we're overriding it with a new behavior to then perform that web service call out. We could also create our own custom new action within one of our Visualforce pages that we could utilize. So an example of that, one of the things that is if you go out to developer.force.com, they show you how you can take a Visualforce page and generate it as a PDF. We could then take that PDF and attach it to a record as an attachment. So insert it into attachments and then associate it with a certain record based on whatever our logic is. Well, the attach PDF to record it's not it's not one of the standard actions that are available from our Visualforce pages. So we could code that logic we could code that logic on our own using a custom method. So override or make new actions available. We could also, another popular thing to do would be to control the navigation. So we might want to send the person to a different place than they would normally go if they were using the standard controller. We could create a multi-step wizard, another use of custom controllers. And then possibly control how information is being returned to the page. There are two types of options that we have here. We have our custom controllers. Custom controllers are referenced with the controller attribute. What we do is we set the controller attribute equal to the name of the class that is the custom controller. So in this case, there is a class called myController. Or we could create a controller extension. Now the controller extension has either a standard controller or a controller attribute. Then it has an extensions attribute, and then this is where we reference one or many classes that would be our controller extensions. Okay? All right. Just to kind of reiterate what's going to happen with our Visualforce pages and our requests that come out. So the first time that we request a Visualforce page that's referencing a custom controller, what's going to happen is that it's going to see that there is, via the controller attribute, that it's referencing a class. And what it's going to do is it's going to then call the constructor associated with that particular class, instantiate an object, and then the Visualforce page is going to then call the getters associated with populating that page with the default values. Then the user will now be returned an HTML page that HTML page is probably going to contain a form where the user can then perform some actions. They then click on a button, and what that button is going to do is that will ultimately call an action method defined within our custom controller. It will then do something, execute some logic, and then once again forward the user to possibly another Visualforce page. We could also forward the user to a standard page within Salesforce, a page layout page, and then continue that process. Another thing that's occurring behind the scenes, and you see this with the view state. So at the bottom of this diagram associated with the Visualforce page is the view state. The way that we track the state of a particular user session is by using the view state. What the view state is we store the state of the user session in the view. In other words, we store it in the HTML that's sent down to the requester's web browser. The way that this works behind the scenes is that we create a hidden input inside of the HTML page that we send to the client web browser. Anytime that user then submits that back up to the controller, we then submit that data, I shouldn't say, we submit that data along with any other data that they fill out in the form of filling out single line entry fields or what have you. But in our controller, we would then repopulate those values with whatever was from the previous page request. It's a lot to sort of consume at this point, but we'll come back to this because we'll get into much greater detail on the way that the view state works when we get into multi-step wizards. There it kind of, it's easier to sort of spell out. All right, as just to recap, there are 3 different types of methods that exist within our custom controller code. There are getter methods, also called accessors. There are setters, which are often referred to as mutators, and then the action methods, and those are the things that when a user performs some sort of action, those are the methods that are called. When you're creating a custom controller, there is no standard controller available, so you must define every action and also every getter and setter that the pages that are using this controller will rely on. Okay? That's in contrast to a controller extension. With a controller extension, to a certain degree, you can rely on the standard controller to execute or take care of some of the, for instance, looking up of data values or performing standard actions. Okay? Getters. Let me talk about getters, setters, and then our action methods. There's a correlation that exists. If we, let me stand, I'm going to walk over here and do a little bit of drawing on this whiteboard here. All right. So there's kind of a correlation that exists between our Visualforce pages and our Visualforce controllers. Now, anytime that, so if on the left-hand side we have our Visualforce page, and on the right-hand side, here's our Visualforce controller. So over here on the Visualforce page, we would have some markup, and then within our Visualforce controller, we'd have some object-oriented Apex code. All right. One of the things that's going to occur is that within our Visualforce page, if we wanted to display some data associated with maybe a specific record, or for that matter, any sort of variable that we declare within the controller, we would reference it through data binding. So if I had a variable called myVar, and I want to display it within a Visualforce page, I would simply do curly brace, exclamation, and then it's called myVar, and then curly brace. All right. Now, what's going to need to exist within my custom controller, my Visualforce controller, is a method to be able to handle the request. So when this Visualforce page wants to display the value for this field or this property, I would need to have a method to be able to handle that request. So over here, I would have a get, and then in this case, my var method. Okay. So upon request or upon viewing this page, one of the things it's going to do is it's going to call all the getters associated with displaying the data. Now down the road, the user might populate, maybe this is a single line entry field, or maybe we click on the edit button, or we're creating a new record, and the user is now going to edit an input field or an input text associated with this data binding here. Well, when the user then fills out that single line entry field, they click on the button and they post the contents of the form up to the Visualforce controller. What we would need in our Visualforce controller to then populate that particular variable is a method called set myvar. Okay? So there's a correlation between the markup in your Visualforce page and the methods that exist within your Visualforce controllers, namely the getters and setters in terms of the way that we interact with the user in terms of viewing data or also setting data. Okay? All right. Okay. Let me jump back here. All right. So in this case, what we have here is we have a reference within our Visualforce page for a variable called data name. Associated with that, in order to access whatever the value of data name is, we would have a get data name function defined within our controller. Here's some sample code. So here I have my class. In this case, this one is a controller. Notice that even though we're looking at a custom controller, there's nothing about this class that indicates that it is a controller per se. It's simply a class which contains, in this case, two methods. Okay. Here I have a public string getName. So if I had within my Visualforce page a binding for name, that would be able to return that. And then here there's actually a method called getAccount. But notice that getAccount isn't returning a string or an integer or anything like that. It's actually returning an S object. What that means is that if I wanted to, within my Visualforce page, I could create a data binding whereby I referenced curly brace, exclamation, and then in this case, account, and then two specific fields, account.id and account.name. The reason that I can only access two fields in this case, because those are the only two fields that I selected in my SOQL query. Okay. All right. I'll talk about, we'll get into greater detail. You notice there's a SOQL query, and one of the things that getAccount does is getAccount contains a SOQL query, and it says where ID equals, and then we have our a bind, and what it does is it calls a class called Apex Pages, and then a method called current page, get parameters, and then get the ID. Well, what that does is it gets the ID from the query string parameters and uses that as a part of the query. Like I said, we'll come back to that in more detail later. So you can think of your standard controllers. If you think about your standard controllers, they come with default methods for getting and setting whatever the object type is for this current, particular standard controller. In addition, they would also have ones oriented with accessing the parents. and then one level down for obtaining references to the children. The set, on the other hand, would only operate on the current object, which is the way our standard controllers work. You can think of behind the scenes when you're utilizing a standard controller, you can think of it almost, having, when you're getting the field values, you can think of it having these default SOCL queries in which it's always selecting all the fields to go out and get all the data so that you can then reference that within your Visualforce page. So in this case, they've taken the shortcut where select ID and then a list of all the fields from our either standard object or custom object. Setters are the flip side. So in the case of a setter, what we're doing is we're providing a mechanism by which a user could do something like fill out that single line entry field, click on a button, that would call the action method. But before it called the action method, it would call the setters. So one of the things that we do is we set all those values that the user would have filled out in the page, and then we will call the action method. So associated with our curly brace data name and then close curly brace, curly brace exclamation then data name, we would have the equivalent set method for data name. There's a golden rule about the order of execution of your methods in controllers. And that golden rule is that setters are always called before any other type of method. There's no particular order in which these setters are called, but you do know that your setters will always be called before either your getters or your action methods. Even though it's a little bit non-intuitive that you click on the save button, you might think that the first thing that's called is the save method associated with that. Not necessarily true. It will call the setters, populate those with values, so that when your action method needs to do something, it then has those data values available. All right, here is another controller example. We have a controller called the controller. We have a few variables which were declared locally. Remember, the default access modifier associated with variables is private within Apex. So here we have a string search text and a list of leads called results, so a list of S objects. And then we have a bunch of getters and setters. So there is a get search text. Get search text is very simple. It simply returns search text, which was that string we declared above. Set search text, once again, also very simplistic. It receives a string as its argument, and then it sets whatever is passed to it, or sets search text equal to whatever was passed to it. There's also a get results. In the case of results, there's not a set results, and the reason is that the results are looked up as a part of a SOCL query from the database, and that's how we go out and populate our results. So in this case, here I have a get results getter method, and it returns a list of leads, and we're going to return results, which is that list of leads that we're going to be populating as a part of our action method. Now at the very bottom, that last method, which is called doSearch, that is the action method. Okay. So the action method is when the user clicks on a button in which the action attribute is set equal to doSearch, what's going to happen is the user clicks on that button, whatever the user entered into the search text, what's going to happen is that it will then execute, first of all, set search text will be called, and whatever the user entered into that entry field will be populated into search text. Then the action method will be called. What it does is it performs a SOCL query. So here's one of the places where we actually get to see a SOCL query. Here it does find, and then it does a bind to the search text string. And returning, in this case, it just returns leads. And specifically, it returns the email, name, and phone fields associated with our leads. We cast it into a list of leads and then set results equal to what we get back. Now you'll notice that we're using, just to explain a little bit about the SOCL query that's occurring here, You'll notice that we're using the array notation. We're accessing the 0th element within our list. Remember that a SOSL query, by default, the return type of a SOSL query is a list of lists. Because we're only searching in leads, our list of lists will only contain one list. Therefore, our results will be a single list of a list of leads. So what we've done is we've simply said, let's just access the first element within that outer list. That's going to be a list of leads. So let's cast it back to a list of leads and then set results equal to that. Okay. Now, another thing that's occurring associated with doSearch is that you'll see that the return type of doSearch is of type page reference. That is how we identify our action methods. So action methods are different from getters and setters. Getters return whatever it is, the type of whatever it is that we're returning. Setters return void because they don't return data. Action methods return page references, and the reason that we return page references is that when a user clicks on a button, they submit a request, we need to then forward that user either to a different location or keep them at the current location. In our case, we are returning null, and the reason we're returning null is that we would like to keep this user at the current location. So anytime you see return null as a part of the return of a action method, that means keep the user in the current location. In other words, at the same Visualforce page. All right, let's take a look at the abbreviated markup associated with our Visualforce page. So here's our reference to the controller and the controller attribute. Notice that we have a input text. We're doing some data binding to search text. Down below that is a command button. The action attribute is equal to an action binding, which is curly brace, exclamation, and then do search. All right. That, if we think back to the diagram I just drew with the Visualforce page on the left side and the Visualforce controller on the right side, well, the action binding is the same name as the method that is the action method, right? Okay, down below this though, so notice that when we click on the action button, its label will be go. What happens is that we're using an attribute called re-render, and that will re-render a portion of our page. It basically allows us to do partial page refreshes within our Visualforce pages. You'll notice that down here at the bottom, there is a page block table. The page block table, the data that will be displayed within the page block table is a list of results. In other words, I'm sorry, a list of leads that we've called results. What we're going to do when we re-render that table at the bottom is we will call the getter associated with our results variable. We're going to go out and get that list of leads and then iterate through each lead that we get back and display them within a row within our table. So what I've shown you so far is we've talked about how there would be a get version of the method and then a set version of the method. Well, it's a really inefficient way to write code to every time you have a variable, first declare the variable, then write a method for getting it, and then write a method for setting it. So one of the things that, I don't know this for 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that Microsoft invented this technique with C#, is they invented or created something called properties. And what properties are is properties sort of automatically are encapsulated. And so it allows you to do a syntax shortcut for creating our accessors and our mutators for the different variables that we create. So if we take a look at the way a property works, well, the way that a property works is it's a little bit, if you haven't seen one of these before, it's a little bit confusing because it kind of looks like It kind of looks like a class, but then also a method, so it's weird the way it's declared. But what we do is when we create a, in this case here we have a property called prop. Its data type is integer, and there is a curly brace to sort of define the body of this property. Within here there is a the keyword get, which is identifying our accessor, and then set, which is identifying our setter. Now anytime that we access prop and we want to read prop, that will then call the getter associated with that. Anytime that we want to access anytime we want to set prop, that'll then call the setter associated with prop. If we take a look at the bottom, notice that here we've actually filled out the body of the get and the set. We don't need to do that. So one of the syntax shortcuts is we can simply have our properties and simply do, if we just want to return whatever the value is, just do get semicolon. Same thing with whatever we pass to the setter, we can just do set semicolon. So it's within a single line and within a small amount of typing, we can essentially encapsulate different variables that we create. We can also apply access modifiers to these. So there's additional things that we can do. If we wanted to do something differently than the default accessor or the default mutator, we could actually, on a case-by-case basis, we could code the body of the getter or the setter. So we could actually modify the getter to do something different, like check to see that or something that exists, or we don't have a null value or something like that, or the setter that the input adheres to some sort of restriction that we have based on what we would allow this value to be set to. Okay. One last thing about properties is that the keyword value, it has a special meaning. Value is whatever is passed to us. So when we're calling the setter, value is the default keyword to refer to whatever was passed to us. Okay, that's why you don't see value declared as a part of a parameter of the signature. Okay. All right. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions you have about any of the Visualforce controller topics that we've been talking about so far. Yes, another question.
It's a related question. So, can we set the lifetime of any of these either properties or getters and setters? Like, I want this to be this variable to be alive for a whole session, or this one's just available for one request and then it gets reset, or is there a way to do that, or do they all kind of?
They're all. The answer is really from an in-memory standpoint. The answer is no, in the sense that there's really a few ways to transfer data around between requests that go up to controllers. There is not, for instance, a session object which is available that you could populate with data that would exist in memory on the Salesforce servers. What does exist is, one, if it's the same controller, you could place it in the view state. So it will be by default placed in the view state. Next time we go to that controller, it would then be repopulated, and we'll come back to that. But if we're passing it between different controllers, there's a couple of options that are available. One is query string parameters. So one of the things that we can do is when we forward a user to a different page, we could pass or populate a query string parameter before we then forward that user. So we could say, some sort of variable equals this, add it to our query string parameters, and then send the user over to the Visualforce page. Then the next Visualforce controller could access the value of that, something like an ID. Then another thing we could do is to store it within the database. So one of the things we might do is to temporarily or to write the data into the database for the purpose of then pulling it out again for using it as a part of the sort of a transaction, if you will, or a larger session that the user might be having with our application.
Okay, so if we choose to do the view state, how long does that last if we put something in there?
You know, I don't know of a timeout. There might be a timeout. Are you referring to like
does
a,
it last my whole session? If I log out and log back in, is my view state reset? Or if I go to another page and come back, is my view state get reset?
Well, the view state is a hidden input inside of a form inside of the HTML. So it will only be available if I then post that back up to the controller that can then be repopulated. So anytime that, you know, for all the stuff that you were describing, all of that is going to reinitialize the form that would contain the view state. So it's fragile in the sense that it's that hidden variable, but once we you know, if we go to a different location or something like that and then go back, request the same Visualforce page, you know, it's no longer contained within that form as a hidden variable, and therefore it's gone. So okay, any other questions? All right, then let's wrap it up.
For more information on Salesforce.com training and certification, please visit www.salesforce.com/training.